Gangnam Style.
Actually, is he doing that too?
Yeah, I don't know.
We're getting ready for week 4. And again, let me just say how much I've enjoyed the threaded discussion. Mark, you commented somewhere on one of the questions, I think it was the third question in week 3, that your concentration was a little bit reduced because of your weariness with all the things you're doing. And my guess is that's true for the vast majority of us. I know this is a tough way to go. Many of you are preaching every week. Almost all of you have full-time jobs and doing additional work for the church or ministry. Some of you have full-time jobs doing ministry, which means you're working 60 hours a week. I understand all of that. I understand the weariness. I'm a bit on the weary side myself. But I still have appreciated your comments and your efforts to contribute and to unpack some of the things that you have for each other. You're asking good questions, and you guys are really having a good conversation. And you may notice I didn't have as many comments week 3 as I have the first 2 weeks. That's because I'm weary too. And so let's just keep on keeping on here and stay as focused as we can to provoke each other and continue to get as much out of this as we possibly can. So thank you for that. This week, week 4, we're getting ready to talk very specifically about Wesley's audience, specifically as it's tied to some of the specific sermons that he has. And so Chris Gates, who is our professor of communication, and he's the one who's responsible for videotaping us and also making us look goofy last week in the video, which he took great pleasure in, I might add.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
we didn't know that the camera was rolling.
And no, these are not sunglasses. I have transition lenses, and it just looks like they're sunglasses. But the 3 of us have been talking about the importance of audience, and that's one of our objectives this week. It says that we'll be introduced to his audiences, and how does that impact and have influence on preaching itself. And so the first question for week 4 is, do you notice any difference in Wesley's preaching at Oxford and his preaching in other places? And that goes to the audience question. Chris Gates is a communications major, and he teaches speech and several other items related to communication here. Dr. Lorenz, his undergrad work is in communication. So it's been fun to listen to them talk about the importance of knowing your audience. With that in mind, I'm going to ask Glenn to maybe unpack a little bit some of the differences that we might be sensitive to as we're reading Wesley's sermons this week as it relates to audience.
Yeah, and so one of the things that, well, kind of the main thing I think that we were talking about was the fact that since Wesley's talking to different socioeconomic strata, and because he's talking not only to university graduates in some places, if he's preaching at the university or in a pulpit, versus if he's street preaching or preaching to the coal miners, he's going to be using different language. And I'm almost wondering if that fact, coupled with the fact that he's preaching over 60 years, is one of the reasons that when you read Wesley, and maybe you haven't read it enough yet, if you're just starting in this, to notice. But when you read Wesley, people feel like he's flip-flopping in sort of the sense that we use when we talk about politics, where he's not giving a consistent message. I wonder, though, if his audience has something to do with that, because when I talk to my 5-year-old about an issue, I certainly don't use the same kinds of language, and I don't go into the same kind of detail. And sometimes I even say things that a seasoned interpreter might say, well, that's not even right, that's not true. Or if I'm going to talk to my Old Testament class, I've given them 4 anchor points for their understanding of Old Testament history. At year 2000 BC, 1500 BC, 1000 BC, and 500 BC. And what I say to them is, these aren't exact dates. In fact, you're going to have to relearn this if you go on to master's degree work or any further work in Old Testament studies, because they're not even right, but they're just anchor points to help us to understand. And so what I wonder is if maybe that's what Wesley does from time to time when he's preaching about a very complex topic that's philosophical in nature. Is there sin in a believer? Well, that's a pretty complex topic, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very complex topic.
So, especially when you talk about the definitions of sin and sin has been forgiven, so is there sin there if it's been forgiven? All these kinds of questions, I think, have a lot to do with your audience.
Yes. Thank you. And that might help me as I read Wesley and recognize that what feels like to me to be proof texting in some cases might more likely be explained in terms of his audience.
Yeah. Sometimes it's easier to grab a quote than it is to unpack a philosophical treatise.
Yes. Especially when you're speaking to people who don't have much biblical knowledge, which actually is not too different than what's going on in our culture.
That's right.
The lack of biblical knowledge is certainly complicating the preaching.
Well, I'm a little guilty of that because I've I don't know if I've actually proof text, but sometimes you get to a point, particularly in the New Testament, and you're trying to get through the point, and to give too much backstory diverts your attention from where Paul is going, for example. Right. To go back and explain the sacrificial system at that point. So maybe you'll go back and you'll grab a piece without reference to its context.
Yes.
And that you wouldn't even defend.
Right.
But you use it in that way.
Yeah, so that might actually be very helpful for me as I'm reading some of these, or rereading these, because I've read them before, and might cause me to modify some of my critique in that regard. So, this coming week, week 4, there's another paper due. And by the way, I'll have your week 2 papers done before this video gets planted on the site. But you're going to be writing a 2 to 3 page paper. And it says in the syllabus that you're supposed to be writing it on Wesley's hermeneutic. Let me just say that's not what I would like you to write on, because I don't think we have enough information to do that. So instead, what I'd like to suggest is that you look in his sermon on the repentance of believers. And on page 406, 407, and it goes over to somewhere. I should have looked. He's got several points here. He's got 20 items. I don't want you to tackle all of those. In fact, what I'm mostly interested in is your reflection on point 2, 3, and 4 on page 406 and 407. So reflect on and respond to what Wesley's saying in that segment of the sermon on the repentance of believers. And if you have questions and need a little more detail about the writing assignment, just send me an email and I'll try and clarify for you. All right? Great. We'll see you.
Bye.